Okay, we got a big class today. And I like today's class because no one would ever put tonight's topic in a class of Jewish values. And it is a class about Jewish law as well, and it definitely counts as a Jewish law topic. But Jewish values, I think most people would not put it into the criteria of Jewish values. But as we will see, it's a very big Jewish value, today's topic. Today's class, lesson 5 of this course, Beyond Right, is titled Beyond Lawful Ownership. Ownership, we'll be talking a lot about the concept of owning stuff. What does it mean? What's the law about it? Etc. Ownership. We all own stuff. We all take it for granted. But really, all societies run off of the concept of ownership. We build equity. You could make transactions. You could buy things. You could sell things, contracts. All these things are predicated on the concept that people own stuff. So let's talk a little bit about ownership. So here's a story. There's a father-in-law there's a father who marries off his only daughter, and his son-in-law marries in. So he tells his son-in-law that you're my dear son-in-law, I'm bringing you into the family business, 50% you're getting. He says, so this is what I want to do. You right now own 50% of the company. I want you to work in the, in the factory part of the company, on the floor, in production, as the word. I want you to work in production. I'll work in the offices. You'll be in charge of the production floor. So he says, listen, father-in-law, I'm very grateful, but production is just not going to work for me because I have allergies and the production floor. I'm going to get very sick. I can't do the production floor. So the father-in-law says, okay, no problem. You'll do office, I'll do production.
I can't do office.
He says, I can't do office. He says, okay, listen, let's split the office. You'll do marketing, I'll do sales. He says, marketing, I got no tact, I have no vision, I don't understand what sells, what doesn't sell. So he says, okay, you'll do sales, I'll do marketing. He says, I don't know, sales, I'm not a people's person, this and that. So the father-in-law says, look, what are we going to do with you? So the son-in-law says, simple, just buy me out. Okay, let's do 3 case studies that will help us start getting our hands and feet wet with ownership-related questions and dilemmas. And let's see where this takes us. All right? We'll let the conversation go from there. Case study A, page 136. Here we go. David and Mark are friendly work colleagues. One day, David is terribly hungry at work and in a terrible rush to boot. He notices that Mark had stored some food in the office refrigerator, but Mark is out of the office and unreachable. David reasons that since Mark is absent, he does not need the food that day and he could replace it for him tomorrow. Considering the circumstances and their general friendly relationship, David is certain that Mark would allow him to eat his food. End case study. In your opinion, may David eat Mark's food? Simple little case. What do you say?
I think this goes back to what we were talking about the parking spaces.
Ooh, good memory. Wow. Okay, very good.
So, and I think what we said then is if it does not materially or significantly harm the other by letting the person who's there use it, then they should be allowed to use it.
Oh, so you could say, we learned in lesson 1. I'm actually very impressed, you guys. Sometimes, I stopped trying to do this, but sometimes I'd be in a course, and at lesson 5, we're 5 weeks in from the first class, and I'll be like, remember what we learned in lesson 1? And I'll try to carry on, and I realize I lost everybody. Why? Because no one really remembers, and I can't repeat the whole lesson 1, and so I'm actually very impressed that, okay, but what did we learn in lesson 1? It's a simple concept. We learned in the first class of this course, we learned the first principle of Jewish ethics, which is also Jewish law, which is, in a case where one person will benefit and the other person will not lose, you have to give the person that benefit. An example we gave was a parking spot. If you're living for 3 months in the summer and your neighbor is redoing their parking lot, their driveway, and they need to park the car somewhere, be a mensch. Well, what's it gonna hurt you, right? So could we bring that principle over to our case, right? Mark has lunch. He left early. We know he's not coming back till tomorrow. David wants to, David is hungry, doesn't have any time to spare. Mark's lunch comes from the corner grocery shop. Big deal, it's a sandwich. I'll go there tomorrow morning. I'll buy him a fresh sandwich. Big deal. No more friends. I know he'll be happy. I know he'll be just fine. I know that tomorrow morning when I tell him that I did it, he'll say, with pleasure, David, we're friends. Of course. Could he do it?
It matters to me that you just said that it was from the corner grocery store. Because to
Okay.
me, like if it was his mother's chili, something like that, a special dish that
Right.
he can't replace with the
You can't
generic,
replicate it, right?
then it's a lot harder. But if it's a can of tuna that was just sitting there, and you can buy the identical can of tuna, and maybe he'll never even know,
Right.
that makes it a lot
Right.
more
So I think that's
palatable. For,
yeah, and I think that's important to mention. I think that's an important part of the case over here. That it's very easy to replace. Exactly, right? It's not a personal homemade. It's like his wife made his favorite lunch, and you know what I'm saying? It's something you could go.
Time if his wife had made his favorite lunch.
I agree.
Yeah.
Right. If we'll say, I'll go and make you the tuna sandwich. No. You don't know what you're doing. My wife knows exactly how much mayonnaise to mix in with the tuna and the pickles to put in, and don't. Okay, so what do you say? Who's for yes? Who's for no? By raise of hand, who says yes? David can go. Gesundheit, take the lunch, and it's not a problem. Anybody raise a hand? Dr. Lieb, you want to say something? I can't really hear you. I don't know why.
He said, "Welcome back." I think.
Tomorrow.
Is your book covering your microphone?
So,
It's a little bit difficult to hear you, doctor. I apologize. That's frustrating. Okay. All right, who says no? David should not take it. Are you?
Do I not also recall from the parking discussion that you really needed to seek permission in advance?
No. In a case where you're using somebody else's property, Jewish law would even let you do it without permission. Something a little bit more extreme, like squatting, is already a little bit more of a.
Right.
What if Mark comes back? Okay. Oh, Dr. Lieb is asking a good question. What if Dr. Lieb is going to come back before tomorrow? So here's where you could say they can never know. Maybe Mark actually had in mind to come back to the office at 7 p.m. tonight to do some midnight work, and he was relying on that sandwich for some midnight snacking. He's going to show up, and the corner shop is closed already, and he lost his thing. Okay, so here we could already go into the world of hypotheticals, Joel. Let's say he knows for a fact that Mark took off to Chicago. Oh, that's it. I'm going. I decided last minute I'm going to Chicago. I won't be back till tomorrow. Let's say we know for a fact. Okay, who says no? Julie and Doug, you both said no, right? So who wants to? Do you want to explain why not?
I'm thinking on the same line as Dr. Lee. Basically, if he comes in tomorrow and he's counting on having that lunch and it's not there, he's upset.
Could never know, right? You're saying it's just
Yeah.
you could never know. And at the end of the day, you didn't ask him permission. And for the sake of the hypothetical case study, we don't know. For some reason, David can't call Mark. Okay, let's say before the days of WhatsApp and texting. Okay. All right, let's move on to case study B. All right, we have a question here. Case study B, very simple case, page 137. Sarah strolls along a street and discovers a bracelet lying on the sidewalk. She tries her hardest to track down its owner, to no avail. In your opinion, may Sarah keep the bracelet? Very simple case. You find something, what do you say, no?
No, because what if the person said, oh, I think I know where I lost it. It must be laying here somewhere. And then, well, somebody already picked up.
Somebody took, right. So let's say the owner is going to remember that they were there and come back.
And see if
But it says she tries her hardest to track down the owner. Now, what does that mean? That's a very vague standard. She tried her hardest. Who determines what's hardest? Who determines what's trying hard enough is? Okay, but for the sake of the argument, you're saying, is there ever a time that somebody who finds something is allowed to keep it? What do you say?
I would say if she tried her hardest, she can keep it, but that keeping it is conditional, meaning that if the person a year later comes around, you can find this necklace, she has to give it back.
That's it. It should be conditional to if the owner ever comes back, gotta give it back. Is that indefinite, by the way? What happens if it's 30 years later?
I would think it's indefinite.
Okay, indefinite. All right. Who says yes? She should keep it. Anyone for yes?
So the alternative to keeping it is putting it back on the sidewalk
Oh.
or bringing it to the police or.
You could just ignore it. Just put it right back. You could turn it to the authorities.
Someone else will take it.
Right. You could keep it, or you could keep it conditionally. It's another option, which is keep
There's
it.
this- If there's a
What was that?
store, if there's a store there, turn it into the guy at the store. And if the lady comes back, then she would ask the store guy if he has found the bracelet.
That's right. So say you found in the parking lot of a Meijer. What do you do?
She'll give it to his wife.
Yeah, this happened to me actually not too long ago, before the pandemic. I found a wallet by Meijer. I brought it into customer service. I said, somebody comes back here looking for a wallet. Here it is. Okay, so that's a simple thing to do.
There's
Is
also,
anybody for a hard yes that if she tried to find the owner to no avail, she could walk off with it? Is anyone for that?
I have a
No, but-
conditional statement on it though.
Nechama says yes.
You asked another question, Rabbi. You
What's
said,
up?
was there any case where a Jew can keep what they find?
Right. That's basically the underlying premise of this case
Is
study.
that cash, like cash?
Oh, let's say it's just cash, not a bracelet. Okay.
Because you can't prove ownership of the cash.
Because then how are you supposed to prove ownership? You asked them to tell you the serial number, right? That should work well, no? Okay, all right, case study C. Let's move on to the next case study, page 137. Our last case study for today. Leah strolls along the street and notices Naomi at a fair distance ahead of her. She watches in dismay as Naomi's bracelet falls into the gutter. Another bracelet, okay. Naomi tries unsuccessfully to extract the bracelet from the gutter. She throws her hands up in despair, gets into her car, and drives off. When Leah reaches the spot, she lifts the gutter cover and succeeds in extracting the bracelet. All right? In your opinion, may Leah keep the bracelet or must she attempt to locate Naomi and return it?
Must return it.
Must return. You're saying you know whose it is. You've seen her trying to get it. So the original owner couldn't get it. Let's say you happened to have a crowbar and you go and open it up.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
what if that was the bracelet that the other one found? Naomi found it on the sidewalk and took it, and then she lost it.
The plot thickens.
Sorry to interrupt.
It's a good question. Okay, so who says that she has to give back to Naomi? Is everybody for giving it back to Naomi? Anybody that says, listen, let her keep it. She found it. Anyone say that?
How do we know she knows Naomi? It doesn't say she knows her. It says
Right.
sees her.
Oh, that's right. Which means for the purpose of the case study, we're giving her a name. Maybe she doesn't know who it is. But she at least has some form of identification. Right?
Maybe.
She knows it's a woman. She'll be able to give some basic identification, the information.
Maybe. Yeah.
She knows maybe what type of car she went in. I don't know.
That's a big
All right. Well, that gets it. How hard do you have to try to work to find the owner?
Exactly.
Or the other way to look at this case is that Leah witnessed Naomi give up. Naomi tried to get it, moved on, and at this point you could say she gave up. She forfeited.
I know that she wouldn't come back.
How do we know she won't give back? Very, very good.
She had somewhere to be. She couldn't spend another half hour
With
with
a
nothing.
lifting device.
Maybe she was gonna go get a crowbar.
Right.
So the case study says that she throws her hands up in despair. She kind of is reading her body language, and she sees this sense of giving up. I don't know. Okay, so you're saying, how do we know?
family will tell
how does
you.
she not know that she's going to get help?
Say, what was that, David?
Maybe she's trying to go and get help.
He's trying to go and get help, right? Okay. So we have 3 case studies, and this is what we're going to be doing right now. All right, dear friends? let's explore the Jewish value of ownership. There's a value, there's a Jewish understanding of a value, that we own property, we have possessions. And then once we learn about the value, then we'll go to law, as we usually do, right? Law, then we'll segue into value. Let's begin with law. So I want to begin by getting a little bit deep over here, because we all take very for granted the idea that we own stuff. I own a car, I own my house. Why do you own it? Because I pay it. Or as my neighbor once told me, people think they own their house, really the house owns you, right? Okay. You don't own your house owns you. Okay. But in any case, you own your car. Why do you own your car? I paid for it. I have a title, I have a deed. It says I own it. Okay. I own stuff. So we take it very for granted. But there is an interesting question, which is, what makes you own anything? With what power? Or what is that? What's the concept of ownership? Why do you own something? And this takes us into a little bit of the world of philosophy. And there's two philosophical takes on this question. What determines ownership? What kind of creates ownership? And I want to share with you briefly these two sides of the coin. And then we're going to read, I want to share with you two texts. We'll read it inside. One opinion, one philosophical take on what is the notion of ownership is that ownership is really just a figment of imagination. There's nothing actually that says, there's no, it's not set in stone. There's no law of nature that this phone, that the materials within this phone belong to me and not to you. Rather, ownership is a social construct. It's a convention. For the sake of social order, right? You say, for the sake of a running and healthy society, what do you need? There needs to be a basic agreement between people that this is mine, this is yours, this is not yours, this is not mine, etc. And then we could trade, we could sell, we could have an economy, we could respect each other's property and possessions, etc. But it's not a real thing. It's not a reality. Everything you own is really just a social construct. We, humanity, or the government creates a system that says this belongs to you, but it's arbitrary. It's not real. And again, why do we do it? Just like that, we could have a functioning society where we have this common agreement, this common understanding. I own this, you own this, and that's kind of the rules within which our economy functions within. Does that make sense? This philosophical take? Okay. Then there's another side to the debate. The other side of the debate is no. Ownership is a reality. It's inherent, which means you actually own the things that you own. There's a law of nature that somehow, through some process, that determines that this actually becomes yours. You could say that we're just quibbling, who cares? Is it this, is it that? But it actually does have a lot of practical differences, the way you understand what ownership is. And hopefully we'll get to that in a moment. But basically the question, if you want to kind of put the question in a good catchphrase, this is the way how to understand the question. Do you own something because the law says that you do? Or does the law say that you own it because you actually own it? Understand? Should I repeat that? Does the law say that you own, do you own your car because the law says that you own it? Or does the law say that you own it because you actually own it? Is law recognizing a reality of ownership? Or is law creating this institution of ownership? All right, we have these two concepts. Now let's read them inside. All right. Text one. Okay, it's a little bit deep, it's a little bit nuanced, a little bit philosophical. All right. You say the joke. There's once a philosopher who spent 7 months meditating and thinking, pondering in his closet. He's thinking and thinking and thinking and thinking. He walks out and he goes over to his friend and says, "You know what I've just discovered? Life, I found the perfect analogy for life. Life is like a piece of herring. So his friend says, and why do you say it's like a piece of herring? So he says, you know what? Maybe it's not like a piece of herring. It's the point of it is that just sometimes you get lost in these stupid things and just these stupid philosophical type of and just it's meaningless. But and in any case, but it's an interesting two sides to the coin. What is ownership? Is law kind of creating this imaginary convention of this construct of ownership just for the sake of convenience, just for the sake of social order, just for the sake of just a nice, healthy, functioning society a framework we could work within? Or is ownership a real thing that the law is simply recognizing?
And I swear I'm not cheating by looking over here.
You could cheat.
But I was thinking, that some of it depends on sort of the Jacob and Esau question.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, when people are hunter-gatherers and they're just hunting animals and everything else, there's no real concept of ownership of the deer in the forest. It's anybody who chooses to hunt it down and get it, although maybe the meat you might have a fight about, but at least a deer. If you're actually farming the land and putting your labor into it for, so many months, you've got to have some sense of ownership, whether it's you or your tribe or your family or what have you, but you got to have some sense of ownership. So Esau, who goes off in the wilderness, doesn't need it so much. But Jacob really needs that, or else his flocks go to somebody else.
But even Esau, let's say, shoots a deer, and then when he shoots that deer and actually takes it, does he own it then? Yeah, the deer was ownerless.
Yeah, so that's the model where you've put your sweat into it and made it your own.
So then there's okay. So what makes it that? Okay, so let's read the two texts. Let's go with text 1, page 138, and this is one side of the coin, which is ownership as a social convention. Would you like to read, Alan?
Sure.
Take it away.
Hobbes and Hume argue that there is no natural mine or thine, and that property must be understood as the creation of the sovereign state, or at the very least, the artificial product of a convention entered into by all the members of society to bestow stability on the profession of external goods and leave everyone in the peaceable enjoyment of what he may acquire by his fortune and industry.
All right. So according to this, Hobbes and Hume, I'm not that familiar with their works. Okay, but in any case, the text tells us Hobbes and Hume say it's just a social construct. We are only the law or the government or the people create this artificial product of a convention. It's artificial. It's made up. Let's say, this is yours, this is mine, and that helps us have a healthy, working society, an economy, etc. Okay, this is one secular legal theory of ownership. Now let's go to the other side. Text 2, on page 138, ownership as an ontological reality. You know what ontological means? Ontological means natural or inherent, innate. It's a reality. It's a law of nature. It actually is. That's the other side of the coin. Terry, would you like to read? No? Okay, no problem. Pam, go ahead. Would you like to? Text 2, page 138.
Ownership as an
Ontological.
ontological reality. John Locke, 1988.
It's fine. Just skip that.
On the other hand, was adamant that property could have been instituted in a state of nature without any special conventions or political decisions. Locke did not base his resolution of this difficulty on any theory of universal eutactic consent. Instead, in the most famous passage of his chapter on property, he gave a moral defense of the legitimacy of unilateral appropriation. Though the earth be common to all men, yet every man has the property in his own person. This no body has any right to let himself. Labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature had provided and left it in, he had mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature placed in it, it hath by this labor something annexed to it. That excludes the common right of other men. I feel like I'm in law school or something.
You feel like, yeah, it's a bit of a, you got a lot of that jargon here. This is a very interesting text. So on the other hand, we have John Locke. Okay, he's a colorful character. We've done right before the pandemic, we had a course, Judaism's Gifts to the World. And we quoted John Locke then quite a lot. So John Locke says no. He says, what's ownership? He says, ownership is a reality. You actually own things. It's not a convention. It's not politicians or through some political process that you come to own things. It's a law of nature. It's a reality. And he has a very interesting way of explaining to it. He basically says that the one thing that that everybody agrees on, you actually own as a reality, that you ontologically own as an ontological reality, to use that fancy term, is your body. Everybody understands that. You can't argue maybe somebody else owns your body. No, it's my body. So John Locke then says that anything of nature that you change through the own effort and work of your body, that is the process by which humans come to own things. So if you build a table out of a tree in the middle of a forest of nature, no one owns it. That tree, that wood, that table becomes yours through your effort of your body. You annex it through your labor. Why do you own your car, according to John Locke? Because you worked. You worked hard. You expended energy, right? You woke up in the morning, you have energy, you worked, now you're tired. All that labor is now traded in for money. That money becomes yours. Why? Through the work of your body. You trade in that money for a car, now the car is yours. Because, right, it's through your labor that you have it. These are two legal theories. And as I mentioned, it really does change the way you look at law and the way you deal with different legal cases of ownership. If you look at ownership as simply something that the law, for the sake of convenience, for the sake of societal benefit, will create as an artificial institution, versus if it's a reality. But I'll give you some examples of that a bit later. But all this was just the introduction. What does Judaism say? So what we're seeing over here is that ownership is not so simple. What's ownership? Is it a reality? How deep is it? Comes along Judaism, and we'll learn right now the Jewish theory of ownership. What's the Jewish theory of ownership? And as Max recently just told us, he said he didn't cheat. Okay. If we want to understand the Jewish value, the Jewish theory of ownership, it takes us back to the story of Jacob. Very, very interesting story. And I want to bring you to one point, but I'll give you a little introduction. So it's a story in the Torah, in Genesis. There's two brothers, Jacob and Esau, diametrical opposites. Jacob is a spiritually minded brother. He's refined. He's focused on higher values, higher goals. Esau's the exact opposite. He's brute. He's crass, crude. And very interesting story, even mysterious story. Their father Isaac wants to bless Esau. Jacob makes as if he's Isaac, steals the blessing. Esau's mad. Esau wants to kill Jacob, his brother. Jacob runs into hiding and goes to his uncle Laban for 20 years. That's the story. As we say in Yiddish, a ganze Geschichte. It's a whole story. All right. And the Secrets of the Bible course, we did a class exploring the story from a more Kabbalistic lens. Okay. Anyways, here's what we're getting to. After 20 years, Jacob built a family. He's also quite wealthy, amassed lots of possessions. And he feels it's time to go back home. He starts traveling back home. And the story goes, there is somewhat of a showdown. Esau still did not give up. He's still mad. And when he hears that Jacob is coming back home, he prepares an army with 400 men to attack Jacob and his family. So it's a little bit of a difficult time in Jacob's life. Let's read text 3. 1 verse, 2 verses from the Torah. And I want you to, while we read this verse, look at it carefully. And I want to ask you what question? Simple question. I want you to think like a biblical commentator who's looking at the Torah, studying the Torah, trying to understand the Torah. What's the question you will have when you read this verse? Jeff, would you like to read? Text 3, page 141.
Jacob took his family and transported them across the stream, and then he brought his possessions across. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn.
Okay. What's happening here? Again, he comes to a stream, which makes sense. You're traveling, you come to a stream. He moves his family across. So just his family was close to 20 people. He has a few wives. He has 11 out of 12 tribes are born already. Okay. He's moving his family across. Then he goes and moves his possessions across. And then he's left alone, and a man who wrestles with him until the break of dawn. And by the way, later on, we learned in the Torah that this man was an angel. Okay, another interesting chapter in Jacob's story. What's the question here when you read this verse? What do you say?
Why did he stay on the
Why was he alone?
Why was he alone? Who just said that? David? And what did you say?
Why did he stay on the wrong side of the stream?
Why did he stay on the wrong side of the stream? Or how did he get back there?
Right.
Let's just think the logic, right? He moves his family across. He goes back, brings his possessions across.
Wouldn't he be across?
Next thing we know, he's alone. How did you get alone? Follow the storyline here, right? He should be at this point on the same side with his family. Is that a simple question? This is what's called in Yiddish a klotz kasha. A klotz kasha means such a simple and obvious question. That's a klotz kasha. So simple. Klotz, by the way, is a Yiddish word. It doesn't mean an idiot. I think in English it means, right? It means like a stupid person. Klotz in Yiddish means like a piece of wood, a plank of wood, a 2x4. It's a klotz. So it's called a klotz kasha because when you hear it, it's such a simple question, but sometimes the simplest questions are the most powerful questions. It hits you over the head with the power of its simplicity. What's going on with Jacob? How's he alone? And the assumption is if he's alone, he's on the other side of the river. How did he get back there? Why is he back there?
Where was the army? Where was Esau's army?
Further down. He wasn't yet at the army. He's still traveling. But he somehow gets left alone and he's vulnerable and he's stuck wrestling with a mysterious man through the night. The Talmud asks this question. There's a continuity error over here, right? There's a detail missing. If you follow the storyline of the Torah, Jacob should be with his family right now. How does he left alone? What happened? Because he was meant to be. I understand, but it has to fit in. That has to be. What happened? What's the circumstances?
He went back to get his possessions.
What was that, doctor?
He went back to get his possessions.
No, it says he already brought his possessions.
Oh, he already
Then he brought his possessions across. What's left? Okay, so this is what the Talmud answers. And the Talmud's answer only adds even more mystery to this whole story. Sometimes that's what happens. You think you have an answer, meanwhile the answer brings up a bunch of more questions. Okay, go ahead, Max. Text 4, page 142.
Rabbi Elazar explains that the reason Jacob found himself alone and exposed to danger was because he had returned to get some small jars that had remained behind. This episode informs us that righteous individuals cherish their possessions more than their own bodies. Why do they care so much? For they never touch stolen property.
Okay, so simply speaking, Rabbi Elazar, who's Rabbi Elazar? Probably the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Familiar with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? Right, but there's actually a lot of Rabbi Elazars in the Talmud, so I'm not sure if that's the one, but it's a safe assumption that's the one. Okay. Rabbi Elazar tells us the missing detail. Jacob went back. Why did he go back? To get the small jars. Or it's like small little possessions, all these like little stuff you leave behind. You know, I'm just coming, late last night I returned from New York. My brother-in-law, Mushki's brother, Label, just got married on Monday. Yeah, Mazel tov. So it's a project to travel with your family, with 3 kids. So we drove, which was a big mazel, because the day that we drove, which we would have flown, you followed the news. Like most of the flights into New York were canceled or delayed. It was a disaster. So it's very good that we just, and I'm in charge of packing the car. And in general, and you know, we stayed in 3 different places. Just in a few days that we were in Jersey, New York, we were constantly going and unpacking the car and packing it back in. It's a lot of sweat for 3 days, for a little bit more. Okay. And it's very interesting that when, you know, so when you travel, you know, you always have the big, you see, you have the big luggage and you have the stroller. They have all these like small little bags. It's like, you know, a little box with this and a diaper bag and this bag and like all these, and that's always the hardest stuff to schlep because you have like all these like small little things. And my laptop bag and my tefillin, all these small little things that need
Where they're supposed to be when you need them.
and it's just a whole hat, you know, like 10 of these small little things. The suitcases are not a problem. The big heavy suitcase, that's not a problem. All this small. So Jacob goes back, they had all this small little stuff. They call it the small jars, because I think that's in general how they stored stuff back in the day. In jars, small jars. So the big possessions he already brought over. He came back with the small jars. Okay, but here's the point. The Talmud says that what does this episode teach us? Let's think about the statement of the Talmud. This episode informs us that righteous individuals cherish their possessions more than their own bodies. Let's pause there. Cherish your possessions more than you cherish your own bodies. It's like a funny thing. That seems like a very reckless attitude. You know, like the people in New York that will jump on subway tracks because they, I don't know, you know, because the ear pod fell on the tracks. Like, are you nuts? For $100, you're gonna risk your life, literally risk your life. Every 3-4 minutes, the subway's coming here, you get killed or get electrocuted on the tracks. That's called you care about your possessions more than you care about your own life, more than your own body. What does it mean that righteous? It's a very weird statement. Righteous people cherish their possessions more than their own bodies. What does that even mean? That's righteous? That sounds very materialistic. Very okay. And then the Talmud says, why do they care so much? You know why? Here's the answer. For they never touch stolen property. Do you understand this answer? I understand they never touch stolen property. How does that answer why they cherish their property more than their body? It's like me saying, you know why I like oranges? Because I'll never steal from anybody else.
The only thing I could even think of is that you know, sooner or later, somebody else will come up and pick up the small jars and they will be in possession of somebody else's property or, you know, from a very hyper technical point, stolen property.
Oh, so you don't want to put anybody else in the position of stealing.
Right.
And if you abandon them, somebody else will be taking your property. But I could argue, what do you mean? At that point, you forfeited it. Everybody understands that forfeiting property is a legal mechanism. You're not stuck in possession always. There's a way that you can mentally or, you know, say this is not mine anymore. No?
Maybe, like, what does property really mean, though? It might not be frivolous things. It might be property that is helping you do a mitzvah and helping you do what you're meant to be doing here, you know?
So Kobe, it's very important. Okay, so pachim ketana, but it says these are the small. The Talmud clearly says in the Hebrew captures it better. Pachim ketanim. You know, the Torah clearly says he already moved over all of his possessions. These are just the small little trinkets, the small stuff, the stuff that always get left behind and moves. You know, when people move, there's always a lot of leaving stuff behind.
So the only thing that this last sentence for they never touch stolen property, you know, we're looking at this through a very contemporary lens. We have a very, you know, developed sense of what ownership is. Could have been meaningfully different back then.
Mm-hmm.
Could have been that stolen property was an expectation, a norm, and that maintaining your own things was very important as a result.
Interesting. So you could give a historical answer that there was different way that they looked at property. And whatever that different way was, made it a lot more important to go and,
Could be.
but the question and the answer doesn't seem to match up, right? Like, you know why I like my house? Because I don't steal from anybody. It just doesn't add up. It's just, I don't understand.
Right, Rabbi?
Yes.
You know, in my opinion, inanimate objects that people have sometimes become part of a person because they remind them of either people that are not there, of good situations. They actually become like a part of yourself.
You say they carry sentimental value.
A sentimental value is something that you wouldn't want to be without because it's part of your soul or your personality or whatever you call it. And to lose something like that, to lose part of yourself.
To lose these, but that would be it. Okay, all right. Moshe, go ahead.
Sometimes we say big things come in small packages too.
Right.
I mean, you could have a little box with a big diamond in it, and
Again,
It
so
looks
these
like a little
are very
box.
nice answers, but this is not what the Talmud answers. The Talmud says, why do they cherish even the small jars? Because they'll never steal from anybody. I just don't understand. It just doesn't add up. Right? Okay. So this is obviously a piece of Talmud. It's beckoning you to dig deeper. The Talmud is obviously saying something very profound, but you have to dig to find a kind of, what's this idea that Jacob cares so much about his small possessions? And what's the idea that it's motivated by not wanting to steal? How does that add up? So I want to share with you, I'm going to read a text now, which is a very deep text. It's from the founder of the Hasidic movement, the Baal Shem Tov. And he gives a very spiritual, Kabbalistic insight into, and this is going to share with us a Jewish value of ownership. So let's read, and then we have a little bit of unpacking, some explaining to do. Would you like to read, Alan?
Sure.
Text 5.
Text 5.
Page 143.
The Torah is highly protective of people's personal assets. This is a result of the major spiritual principle that whichever material items we use, the garments we wear, the food we eat, or the utensils we utilize, we derive benefit from the spiritual force present within each item, for the existence of that item is sustained by virtue of the spiritual presence within it. Specific sparks of spirituality are embedded within each item, and through divine providence, items that are used by particular individuals harbor the specific sparks that are related to their soul. As a result, when we use a utensil, eat food, or wear a garment to satisfy our corporeal needs, we thereby repair the spiritual sparks embedded within them because we subsequently serve God with the energy that our body acquired through that item. We must therefore be highly protective of our possessions, or whatever we own, out of concern for the individualized spiritual forces they possess.
Very deep text, but let's also a very classical concept in Jewish spirituality. This is the idea. Yeah, it really goes back to the purpose of creation. What's the purpose of life? Why do we exist? Why were our souls dispatched to earth? It's not a 5-minute question to answer, right? But if you want to hear it on one foot, there's a purpose. The purpose is like this. God created a world, and this world is a very, very physical, material, naturally unholy place. And God wants it to be a marriage, a connection, a bond, a fusion between holiness and materialism, physical and spiritual. And how is that done? That's the job of a soul. Souls come into this earth, interact with physical objects, physical life, with physical matter. And we benefit from those physical objects. So this shirt made out of cotton. So where does this shirt come from? The shirt comes from a field. It's a product of this physical world. And it was just something, no one owned it. But then some company made it. into cotton, made it into a shirt. I'm wearing it. And now this shirt is now on me. I'm benefiting from it. I live my life with this shirt. You eat dinner, right? Again, you are a soul benefiting from this earth. And through a soul, through the activity of a soul interacting with physical matter, a soul has the opportunity to connect physical matter with a spiritual experience, with holy energy. And that's the purpose of creation. The purpose of life is, from a Kabbalistic perspective, this of course on one foot, is for souls to live on earth, hustle, interact with the world around, and utilize every single object and every single element of our earth for a holy opportunity, for a mitzvah, for a spiritual moment, for a purposeful moment. It's a big idea. We could do a whole course just to work our way through this idea. But on one foot, this is the idea. But it goes even deeper. How many humans exist on Earth? How many Jews exist? I think 14 million now.
Something like that,
Right?
yeah.
Like,
I ask every Jew, they'll have a different number, but yeah.
it's not like anybody ever counted, you know what I'm saying? Okay, so let's say 14 million Jews, give or take a few, right? So you could learn this concept that souls are here to connect physical matter with spiritual experience, with a mitzvah. So you could think that, you know what, it's just like God just sent millions of souls down to earth. And we just all have to hustle. And hopefully we'll accumulatively somehow, hit enough success points. But Jewish mysticism says something unbelievably fascinating. That when God created the world, literally every single atom, every speck of dust, God created every item assigned to a soul. Or to use a spiritual language, the spark of spirituality, the potential for spirituality in any given physical object is associated with a specific soul. So there's this table right here in this room. This table, the spark within this table is associated with one specific soul and no other. And only that soul has the power to activate this spiritual experience that this table needs. So you hear this? Everything is very, very precise. And the Baal Shem Tov, using this principle, explains something unbelievable. The idea of subconscious motivation. When you go to buy a house or buy a car, it's a funny thing. Every house at the end of the day gets sold to somebody. But when you go house searching, when you go house hunting, you'll go to one house and you'll say, not my taste. Or another house, also not my taste. Why not your taste? I don't know, it just doesn't talk to me. And then you walk into the house and say, oh, this is my house. We're doing this house. And same thing, you'll go to a car dealer, you go to the auto dealer. Okay, this car, that car. You'll say, no, not this car. Not. You go into one car, you give it a test drive. This is my car. It's a very funny thing. So sometimes you could clearly explain why you don't like it. Kitchen's too small, kitchen's too big. I don't like the door handles. Right? Everybody has their own mishigas. But most of the times, by these things, you can't really explain it. I don't know why. It's just like a certain impulse where you say, oh, this house is mine, this car is mine, or this whatever is mine. Or even you go to buy a sandwich and there's a whole bunch of options of sandwiches and you say, I just want this sandwich. Sometimes, because I like this, I don't like that, but sometimes you're just drawn to something. The subconscious impulse or the subconscious pull that you'll have to some physical matter. And the Baal Shem Tov says that very often what's really happening is our soul is sensing, is gravitating to its sparks within this world that it is naturally built to come into contact with. And the soul will sometimes start pulling us there, just like a magnet. I'm sensing that this is where our purpose is. This car, this object, this neighborhood, these people, these opportunities. right? It's a very interesting thing. Using this principle, the Baal Shem Tov starts answering the questions. Why do the righteous care so much about their possessions? Because they understand their possessions are not just stuff that we acquire to give us joy, to give us pleasure, to live, to have higher quality of living. Ownership is a very deep experience. It's a very deep responsibility. The purpose of life is in your possessions, in things that you own. And it's very real. You can't just abandon things. Anything that you own, any experience that you have, is an integral part of who you are and what you're needed for. You can't abandon that. So the Talmud says the righteous cherish their possessions, the purpose, more than their body, more than bodily living. They don't look at their house just as a place to be able to enjoy themselves. They look at their house, they cherish this for the purpose. And the Baal Shem Tov says, you know why the Talmud says, where do we learn this from? The righteous don't steal. What does that mean? It's a bit of a deep idea. The world is God's world. Every object was created for a purpose. If we don't use our physical possessions in line with their purpose, it's misappropriation. It's misappropriation. To a degree, it's on some level, it's similar to stealing. You're robbing. You're robbing the world of what it's meant to be. God gave you these things for a purpose. You're robbing that. That's a deeper meaning of this piece of Talmud. That the righteous live life and see their possessions as an integral part of their mission, and they cherish that. And Jacob does not abandon anything because of this principle. Yes?
It's the concept that those sparks, I'm gonna go and buy a loaf of bread, and I've gotta pick out between different ones, that there's a certain loaf of bread that even before I get to the store is connected with me.
Yeah.
But do we always get it right? In other words,
Oh.
might I pick the wrong loaf of bread?
So it's not our business. That's a good question. So does that mean that we have to start being worried, maybe I'm living in the wrong house? Okay, listen. You know what? I think I gotta move to a different neighborhood. Listen, none of us know. This is all in God's hands. Our job is to be in tune to life and to embrace every moment. So here's a classic example. Let's say you're flying and you got to make an emergency landing in Texas, Houston, Texas. So you think that your flight was canceled and your schedule's ruined and your life is ruined and you're in a bad mood, and right? And just nothing's going right. Judaism would say, no, you know why you went there? Because there's a spark that you and only you, that's your mission. There's some physical, you need to do a mitzvah there. There's a spark within this world that's waiting for your unique, specific soul to go there and come into contact with that. So this is really where we use the concept of divine providence or hashkacha pratis, right? We spoke about this in the last course. God is running the world. And part of the design of God is that God brings us to our opportunities. But the idea is that if we own something, that itself is an indicator that this is a big part of who we are.
But not for sure, again, if we chose wrong.
We're not meant to think that way. The fact is, if we have it, hashkacha pratis, that means that we're supposed to have it. And there's a purpose for us with that. And this is not just things, it's everything. It's opportunities, it's talents. But for our purpose, it's simply physical possessions, material possessions. Everything is important. What we're getting to here is that ownership is a very real thing in Judaism. And from a legal perspective, I want to start segueing into the legalities of this. Ownership is not just something, it's not just a concept that we use just for the purpose of, healthy functioning society. We need an economy, we'll say you own this, I own that. Judaism sees ownership as a very deep and real thing. You own something that's real, that's very important, it's an extension of your soul. John Locke says that why do you own things? Your ownership is an extension of your body. Judaism says your ownership is an extension of your soul. But Judaism maintains, and and we're going to see this in a moment once we go into law, that ownership is a very real thing.
I'm confused about text 6 in the context of,
Text 6, we didn't do text 6. 5.
I thought we, getting ahead of myself though. Never mind.
No problem. Save your question. We'll get there. Okay. Now I'll just tell you, United States law, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, generally does not ascribe itself to any one model of the two theories, of the two secular theories, which means does the United States law say that ownership is simply a social construct, or does it say it's a real thing? Per policy, United States law does not ascribe to one over the other, but generally speaking, it follows the first theory of Hobbes and Hume, which is it's a social construct for the benefit of society, right? Am I right about that?
I think generally, yes. Certainly it's set up, society is set up to recognize your ownership rights. And the legal system is very specific about establishing, at least for certain types of property, who owns it. And it doesn't matter why.
Right, doesn't matter why, but sometimes it comes up, I've seen it comes up in law sometimes. And whatever court it is, we'll have to kind of take a position on, is this just society saying it, or,
Right.
okay. And we'll see, let's move into law. That's the value. I spent a little bit more time than I wanted to on the value. And that's the Jewish value. How are we doing? It's a little bit deep, a little bit more spiritual than we've been doing the past few weeks. But now let's go to law. And we're going to see how the value is really the undercurrent, is steering the direction of Jewish law. Okay, we're about to go into Jewish law, but I want to make two quick pointers before we go. We have another half hour left of today's class. We are not, I don't want anyone to walk out of the next half hour thinking that we are covering the topic of ownership in Judaism in any way comprehensively. We are not. What I want to do with you is share with you 3 principles when it comes to ownership in Jewish law. But these are just principles. The application of these principles and all the variables of cases are so complex and so nuanced. And this is literally a full tractate of Talmud. More than one tractate. It's about ownership and property rights, etc. So that's first of all. We're not here to cover this comprehensively. And we could ask questions, and we could on all of these 3 principles until tomorrow morning. And as the Talmud says, the door of questions never closes. That's the way it works. You could always ask questions. Always keep on asking more questions. At a certain point, right? But that's the first idea. It's very complex, but we'll at least study principles. 3 principles. Number 2, which I think is important to mention, we are studying Jewish law. As we're going to see, and as we could safely assume, the law of the land that we live in and that we need to abide to in our interactions with fellow citizens of the United States is going to be different than Jewish law. Whenever there's a conflict, Judaism teaches we have to follow the law of the land, unless there's a prior agreement between 2 parties that we're going to follow strictly Jewish law. But in ancient Israel, this was the law of the land, Jewish law. And today, in a case where Jewish law is going to give you a leniency or stringency, you can't use that against somebody else. So practically speaking, you have to follow the law of the land. At the same time, we study Jewish law. Why we study Jewish law? First of all, it's a mitzvah to study Torah. You study Torah. No good reason. But number 2, we're learning how Judaism thinks. We're learning the values. We're learning the attitudes of Judaism. So with those 2 introductions, let us begin studying Jewish law. And again, 3 principles. Let's begin with the first principle. The first principle will take us to case study A. What was case study A? David and Mark. David wants to eat Mark's sandwich. David is sure that Mark is going to let him, is going to be happy that he eats it. He's going to buy him a fresh one tomorrow morning. Is David allowed to? That was the question. So, we all understand. Ask any upstanding citizen of the United States. Stealing is wrong. Everybody agrees stealing is wrong. Stealing is immoral, but it's not always so black and white. Yes, stealing is wrong, but there's a lot of black and white. What's the example? Examples, case study A. You're such a good friend with Mark. He has a sandwich. Can you go and take his sandwich from the fridge? You know he's going to be cool with it. Is that stealing? Doesn't feel like stealing. So you could argue, and I think most of you argued this, big deal. We know for a fact that Mark is not coming back today, right? And again, right, going back, hypothetically, let's say we know that he took off to Chicago. He's not coming back till tomorrow at 10 a.m. We know he's not going to eat the sandwich today. I could buy him a brand new one tomorrow. I know he's going to be so happy with me. You know, he's it's going to be a pleasure. He doesn't mind me taking it. Many would say it's not a big deal. Let him take it. It's not stealing. Come on, it's a friend. If you go into a random fridge, you start taking food and you don't know whose you took it, that's called stealing. In this situation, the circumstances would say it's not stealing. Let's read Jewish law. Let's read Jewish law. Text 6, page 144. Would you like to read? All right. Text 6, page 144.
Okay. Consumption and assumptions. If you enter a private orchard or garden, you may not pick its fruit without express permission from its owner. This applies even if the owner of the orchard is your dear friend, and it will certainly be extremely pleased to hear that you enjoy their fruits. Nevertheless, since the owner is unaware of your actions in real time, it is forbidden to benefit from the fruit. This principle applies in all similar cases. The public must be cautioned regarding this law because it is commonly transgressed due to a lack of awareness.
Okay, so the Code of Jewish Law, and by the way, there's a course next winter, which is a tour of the Jewish library and the development of Jewish academia. But we'll have a full class. We'll learn that there's actually many different versions of the Code of Jewish Law. Basically, in every single era, it was updated and published again by different new people. It began with Maimonides, close to 1,000 years ago, and even 200 years ago. And a certain way, even 50 years ago, there's like newer versions of newer halachic authorities who, updated it and brought it up to date with new cases or whatever. So this is a more recent from the Alter Rebbe, from the founder of Chabad, this version of Jewish law. He says that people don't know about this. We have to really educate people. People think that if there's a case where you can assume that your friend is going to be cool with you taking something of his, you could do it. Why not? Because from a moral perspective, it seems just fine. My friend's going to let me. Judaism says 1 second. Ownership is not imaginary. Ownership is not a construct. Ownership is real. This soul owns this object. If you going into that fridge and opening up the fridge and taking it, what are you doing? Factually speaking, you're stealing. Objectively speaking, that is an act of stealing. It's somebody else's sandwich and you are stealing from him. You have just forcefully taken away something that he owned. If you say that ownership is a social construct, then again, it doesn't make a difference. Because logic would dictate, and just convenience would dictate that this is not a problem. Yeah, he owns it, but the whole ownership is just there to protect people. And this is a case where we could all understand that society would say, big deal, take it, but give him a new one. Doesn't make a difference. But if we're going to take ownership for real, this is a real thing. Your soul is connected with this thing that you own. It's in your possession. You're not allowed to just go and take away somebody else's possessions, period. And if you want to go back to lesson 1, if I'm not going to confuse you right now, Judaism says you're allowed to use somebody else's parking space, because that's using somebody else's possession. Here we're talking about taking it away, consuming. That's different. That's stealing. And Judaism takes this to an extreme. Fact is, another person owns it. If you take it, you have just stolen from somebody else. But we take the concept of ownership very, very, very literally. If they don't know in real time that you're taking it, and if they didn't give consent in real time, then it's still theirs. And if you eat it, you've robbed that from them. Now, Jewish law would say, Jewish law also gives some nuance over here. Jewish law would say, let's say you have an old, ongoing relationship with Mark, that you eat his lunch and he eats your lunch, and you're all very cool with it. So if you already have an ongoing agreement where you and Mark already consented to sharing your lunches with each other, whenever you're hungry, whenever each other, then Jewish law would say that's already fine. Why? Because the precedence of Mark agreeing that you could take his sandwiches already means that you currently in real time have his consent to take it from him, which means he's already kind of transferred ownership potentially to you. But if there's no such precedence, then right now it's his, and he has not given consent. He has not made the deliberation to transfer ownership to you. You're not allowed to take it. So very simply, this is the first principle of Jewish law. Ownership is very, very real. It doesn't matter how illogical it is, doesn't matter how inconvenient it is, it's a reality.
If there's a match between the sparks of what I own and me, how can I even voluntarily give it to somebody else?
That's fine, because you could do that, that's fine. And if you want to talk about the spirituality of it, very often one physical object needs more than one soul, needs multiple souls. So we're not meant to get too obsessive over this concept and say, you know what, I got to be a hoarder from now on. I'm never giving anything away. I'm keeping my pair of shoes from 35 years ago just because of, my sparks. The point is that anything we own, we should see this as a meaningful opportunity. But we're not meant to get too caught up in maybe yes, maybe not, maybe I'm buying the wrong thing, maybe it's definitely something which is beyond our active control over. But the point is, if we have it, but there's this concept, sometimes more than one soul is needed, which is why we sell things, why we share things, and why. And again, it's not for us to think, are you the right person? Should I be sharing this with you? I don't know. Maybe it's somebody else. You could drive yourself crazy, trying to double guess yourself. And there's no right or wrong way to measure that. Only God knows how to. We are not capable of understanding that. This is the first principle. So in case study A, can David go and take Mark's sandwich? The answer is no. The answer is no. It doesn't matter if morally speaking he could. Morally speaking, there's nothing wrong. But just very, very practically speaking, it's not even pragmatic. It's not pragmatic, but a big deal, taking somebody else's sandwich. You'll buy him a fresher one tomorrow. But the reality is he owns it. That's principle number one. How are we doing? Doing good? Principle number two.
What if he has all of a sudden really low blood sugar or something and he really needs that to have his sandwich?
Okay, so that's already an emergency. An emergency case, a lot, yeah. Yeah, especially something which is more life-threatening or is a bit of a scare, absolutely. Just this past Shabbos, so we were with our whole family, and the Shabbos before a wedding is called the Ufruf, when the chassan, when the groom gets an aliyah, and it's a very. So we're together with the whole family. We were by the Rebbe's Ohel. We stayed there for the Shabbos. And Shabbos morning, one of the people there, one of the individuals that they were at the Ohel, had like a little seizure. And thank God it wasn't anything, but some of a bit of a medical issue. He had a seizure, and it was quite actually beautiful in a certain way to see how casually cell phones were being used by Orthodox Jews who keep Shabbos will never use a cell phone. But it wasn't even a question. They called his wife. His wife wasn't there. They called his wife. They called Atzola. It's all meaning. It's in a moment of an emergency. It's and just I like always mentioning it. Jewish law says in very strict terms that when there's a life-threatening situation on Shabbos and the laws of Shabbos need to be broken, the Jewish law says mitzvah begadol. It's a mitzvah that a greater person should violate the Shabbos, just to prove the point that don't hesitate over here. And Jewish law says, which is it's very unique for Jewish law to give such commentary, such colorful language, because usually law is very black and white, just telling you the facts. Jewish law says if somebody is hesitant to break Shabbos in a case of a medical emergency, Jewish law calls him a chassid shota, a pious idiot.
If I'm keeping Shabbos right.
Yeah, you're trying to keep Shabbos, meanwhile you got it all wrong. The same God that told you to keep Shabbos is telling you to violate it right now. So who's this about? Is it about you or God? You're being a pious idiot, a pious fool. You're such a. But it says mitzvah begadol. It's a mitzvah for the greater person should go and use a cell phone on Shabbos. That's. So anyway, so we're talking about in regular cases. Regular cases is somebody. Let's move on now to the second principle, which is finding a lost object, right? The saying goes, finders keepers. I don't know if there's any legal system that actually, is that real? Finders keepers? That's ridiculous. I don't think that's the way law works.
Well, no, not really. I
Not
mean, if you find a $20 bill in a parking lot and there's no
That's
possibility
different,
of,
right.
then it's more or less finders keepers.
Right, because
If
there's no way to
it's
identify
something
that.
that you can identify the owner of, it's definitely not finders
It's not
keepers.
finders keepers, right? So it's not finders keepers. There's a lot of laws. You find something. What is your responsibility as the finder to track down the owner? So let's first learn what common law is. And again, this is not comprehensive at all. This will give us at least a basic definition of what is the law, common secular law, when finding a lost object. Jeff, would you like to read text 7?
At common law, a person who found lost personal property could keep it until and unless the original owner comes forward. This rule applied to people who discovered lost property in public areas, as well as to people who discovered lost property on their property. Many jurisdictions have statutes that modify the common law's treatment of lost property. Typically, these statutes require lost personal property to be turned over to a government official, and that if the property is not claimed within a set period of time, it goes to the finder, and the original owner's rights to the property are then terminated.
Okay, so on a basic level, what's secular common law? If you find something, you keep it until the owner comes. If the owner never comes, you can keep it until, keep it indefinitely. And certain jurisdictions add a statute that you actually have to turn it over to the local authorities, like a police station, and they'll hold on to it for a certain amount of time. How much time is it?
Don't remember.
It's fine, I know, I'm putting you on the spot. Okay, so they have to hold on to it for a certain amount of time, and if the owner doesn't turn up in that amount of time, the authorities will give it back to the finder and say, you can now keep it. That's secular law. Now let's learn what Torah law says. Let's read the verses in the Torah, and then let's compare. We'll start seeing how the unique position of Torah on this. It reminds me of a story. All right, quick little. So my father would always, even as a kid, would tell me that rabbis have to be very tactful. It's not enough, and in Yiddish, there's a cute saying. There's 4 sections of the Code of Jewish Law. And there's a Jewish saying that a rabbi has to also know the 5th volume of Jewish law. You can't buy the 5th volume in a book. You have to acquire it. The fifth volume of Jewish law is common sense. You have to be very smart. And you have to read into situations. So here's a story my father shared with me. He's once a wealthy guy in the shtetl. He was very wealthy, wealthy merchant. And he gets up in the synagogue, he hangs up a sign, he says, I lost my wallet, and I'm very desperate to find it back. Whoever finds it, I'm going to reward them with 100 ruble. Big, big reward. And the beggar of the town found the wallet. He's so happy, I'm going to make 100 ruble. He brings it back to the merchant and says, I found your wallet, I want my 100 ruble. The merchant opens it up and says, 1 second. I see here only 400 ruble in the wallet. I lost it with 500. You've already taken your reward. I'm not giving you anything. The beggar says, what are you talking about? I didn't take any of your money. I'm an honest man. So that's how it's happening over here. The merchant is my word against your word. So the beggar schleps the merchant to the town's rabbi for a ruling. And the beggar tells the rabbi, I found the wallet. He said he's going to give 100 ruble. He refuses to give it to me. The rabbi turns to the merchant and says, what's going on over here? The merchant says, well, my wallet that I lost had 500 ruble. He's giving it back with only 400. He's already taken his reward. I'm not going to give him double. So the rabbi takes the wallet and says, okay, my verdict is I'm giving it to the beggar. The beggar gets to hold on to the wallet. Merchant can't believe it. What's the rationale to this? Why giving it to him? The rabbi says very, very simple. You say you lost a wallet with 500 ruble. This wallet has 400. Obviously, it's not your wallet. You're not. This is a different wallet. The rabbi in the city is playing around. Okay. In any case, no connection to the class. That's just a cute little story that. Okay. Let's read. So we read secular law, text 7. Now let's read text 8. What does the Torah, literally the Bible, say about the laws and our obligation when finding a lost object? And I want you to take this in carefully because I want to point out the differences to you. Next, go ahead. Text
If you
8.
see your fellow's ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it. Be sure to return it to its owner. If the owner is not near you, or if you do not know the owner's identity, take it home with you and keep it until they come for it, whereupon you shall return it. Do the same if you find their donkey, garment, or anything else they have lost. You may not ignore it.
Okay. For the sharp-eyed among you, do you see any differences here between what secular law says your obligation is versus what the Torah law says?
You actually have a duty to seek and return.
First of all, you have a duty to seek and return. The Torah says you can't just sit around and say, I'm waiting for the owner to come. No one came. I get to keep it. The Torah says you have a responsibility to go chase down the owner. So how hard do you have to work? The Torah says you have to take reasonable action. What's reasonable action? Where was it lost? If they hang up a sign there. And by the way, this is very, very common in Jewish communities. You go to the synagogue, they'll say, I found a watch on this date. If you have lost a watch, call me up. Or in the local supermarket. I'm saying this is very, very common. Or in a hall, somebody lost something. So secular law says you have a duty to give it back when the owner comes back. You have to hold on to it until the owner, for a set amount of time. Judaism says you have to go and pursue. Not the authorities. You personally, you have a responsibility to go and put in reasonable effort to go and track down the owner. That's number one. Number two, secular law never mandates you to pick up a lost object. Only if you pick it up, then the law kicks in and says, okay, you're allowed to keep it only until this point. If the owner comes, doesn't come. Jewish law clearly says you may not ignore it. If you walk down the street, you have a responsibility to pick it up and start making it your own business to go and find the owner. You have to bother yourself with that. Okay, and Jewish law starts getting to the things. How much sleep do you have to lose over this? How much money do you have to spend on this? So of course you don't have to go crazy. And what if holding on to this object is going to cost you a lot of money? Okay, so this is all the details of Jewish law, but the principle is you may not ignore it. You may not ignore it. You have a personal duty to return it. And number three, secular law says at a certain point, if the owner doesn't show up, just forget it. It's over. At a certain point, we just say it just doesn't make sense. It's not pragmatic to schlep this whole process out. It's done. 6 months went by, a year went by. We're done. Case closed. Right? Statute of limitations. Jewish law says if you find a lost object, you have to hold onto it indefinitely until the owner comes. Now, let's say you could safely assume the owner died. 100 years went by. What happens if you inherited a lost object from your father? Does it become a generational thing? You have to hold on to lost objects from 600 years ago? Of course, the answer is no. At a certain point, you could sell it. But even the point is, to a certain degree, it's never yours. Theoretically, the owner could always come back and you owe him either the original object or the money equivalent. So theoretically, it's more theoretically. At a certain point, it's not if the owner doesn't come, you usually sell the object, but theoretically, you always owe that person that thing. So, for an infinite amount of time. That's it, period. Why does Judaism have such a formal and such a strict, position on this? Because ownership is real. If you look at ownership as a social construct, then you just say at a certain point, it's just inconvenient. What are you doing? We're still going to say you own it 40 years later, 100 years later. It's ridiculous. A dead person owns this. We only say you own it only for the benefit of society. At this point, it has no societal benefit. But Jewish law says ownership is so real. Doesn't matter. This person always owns it. That's principle number 2. Going back to case study B. Right, what's the name? Case study B was Sarah. Sarah finds a bracelet on the street. Could she keep it? The answer is she has to pick it up. You're not allowed to ignore it. You have to pick it up, and you have to go and track down the owner, and she has to hold on to it and take care of it until the owner shows up.
So out of curiosity, can she wear it while she's keeping it?
It's a very good question. Does she have to just safe keep it? It's a very good question. I don't know. But you could assume that it's not going to get ruined like a piece of jewelry. It shouldn't get ruined. It's it's made out of good
Maybe the owner
material.
will see it.
Maybe the owner will see it. Yeah.
And you explained this on the basis of Kabbalah and the sparks. But Mishnah was written before Kabbalah, wasn't it?
Oh, no. They all come from the same place. They all come from Sinai. When was it actually written down, ink on paper? That has a date. But the teachings and the ideas existed from Moses.
So did the rabbis in the Talmud, was this their thinking then, of how they came up with these decisions?
So one thing for sure. They for sure saw ownership as to use a term, an ontological reality, as an inherent state of existence. Did they use this Kabbalistic concept of the sparks? I don't know. I don't know if they have, but it definitely fits well in and gives us the deeper appreciation why Judaism takes such a hard line, such a hard stance on this. We only have 3 minutes left, but I want to share with you the last principle. So far, we have this very extreme concept, right? Ownership till the end. You can't take somebody else's sandwich, even if they'll be cool with it. Even if it's going to go bad in the fridge, and get moldy, you can't take it. You find something, you got to find the owner. Hold on to it indefinitely. It's theirs forever until they actively give up control. The third principle throws in a lot of nuance and actually gives a leniency. It's the opposite. Till now we have a lot of stringencies. Here we're going to see how Judaism goes to the opposite, but using the same very idealistic standard. Ownership, yes, no. Either it is owned or it isn't owned. And I don't think this third principle exists at all in secular law, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong, Max. Okay? I want to introduce you to a Hebrew word. And if you study certain parts of Talmud, this will literally be, you could talk about this word for years and years and study. The Hebrew word is yiush. Yiush. Y-I-U-S-H. What's yiush? Yiush means when you give up, when you despair, you forfeit. I give up. Giving up, forfeiting, is the mental state of when a human being literally relinquishes their control over something. So, for example, a ring falls down your sink. It's very painful, but you know you're not getting it back. It went down that pipe, it's gone. Right? So what do you do right then? Human psychology is that a normal human being at that moment has yiush. They despair ever getting it. And at that moment, the moment of yiush, you give up. You have just actively relinquished your ownership. So according to Jewish law, the moment yiush happens, boom, it's not yours anymore. This object is now ownerless. And Jewish law says that whenever there is yiush, you could pick it up and you could go home with it because it's ownerless. Period. What just happened? Okay. Did I just say Google? Hey Google? No, now I said it.
So if we go back to the bracelet that was dropped down the grate, the hands are thrown up in despair, and she drives away. Is this yiush?
Is that yiush? If you witness yiush, this actually just happened. Now, why did I just give the example of of the faucet. My wife actually, one of her earrings just fell down. And she right away says, okay, I lost it. It's not even such a nice beer, but yeah, cheap beer. Old, I don't even wear it. She right away gave up on it. And I right away saw that didn't really fall that deep, and I fished it right out. But she had a use. She just gave up on it.
So it's your earring now.
That's my earring. Okay, according to Jewish law, if there is Yush, you could take it and it's yours. Even if you know the original owner. Doesn't matter. It would be nice to give it back to them, but legally it's not theirs. Why? Because there was a legal process called Yush. They have forfeited it. Jewish law, and we of course don't have time. It's 9 o'clock already, and I don't want to keep you here too much longer. But just briefly, Jewish law. I'm going to read one last text before we go. That's it. Jewish law gives us the principles. It's actually very interesting how Jewish law is built on human psychology. You know, it's very interesting how it tells us when there will be Yush by the average human being and when there won't be Yush. And based on that, if we could assume, and Jewish law tells us exactly when we could assume, it's not arbitrary. When Jewish law tells us that we could assume that Yush happened to any given object, then when you find it, and if we could be sure that Yush happened prior to this moment, you could keep it. Even if you could track down the original owner. You have no legal obligation to return it. And they have no legal option to sue you. They have no legal recourse to take back possession. They've relinquished it there. So what are some quick examples of that? Quick examples of that is if it's an unidentifiable object. You find the $100 bill in a Meyer parking lot. Let's say you could tell that the $100 bill has been there for a while. You can see it's wet, it's muddy. You could tell that it's been stuck there in a corner. So it's not like it was just lost 10 minutes ago, which means we could assume that by now the owner realized that they've lost $100. You need there to be active Yush. We can't rely on the fact that the owner will have Yush in a day or two. By the time you pick it up, Yush had to have already happened in order for this to work. You find the $100. There's no way to identify whose it is. What are you gonna do? You're gonna put in the Detroit News, I found the $100 in my parking lot, Keep it. Why? There's no identifiable, there's no way to identify it. If there's a way to identify it, we could work on tracking down the owner. And the owner didn't necessarily give up on it, because I know how to identify it. But like money, like a $100 bill, you find it, and Jewish law says if we could assume like a good amount of time passed, and we could assume the owners had Yush, keep it. Okay, but this is even more extreme. According to Jewish law, here are two scenarios. Any possessions that have survived these two circumstances are automatically given the legal type. The legal is categorized as the owners had Yush. If this possession survived a war, and if it survived a flood. When somebody runs away from war, they gave up on their possession that they left behind. Even though we all know things, of course, do survive wars. It survived, but the owners are assumed to have given up on their possessions. If you find it, you get to keep it. Even if we can know for a fact whose it is. And also a flood. Something got washed away in a flood. You find it downstream. If it was taken away in a flood, you get to keep it. It was lost 10 minutes ago. We know the owner. He's right upstream. Doesn't matter. Now, you could say that's so immoral. Can you imagine that? Let's go back to case study C. All right, what are the names here? Sarah, Nomi. Do we have Sarah again? Leah, Nomi. Leah sees Nomi having Yush. And if we could make the connection, something falling into a gutter, is that similar to a flood? Get something getting carried away with water? Maybe. Let's say yes. I'm not sure. We got to debate that. We got to think about it. She had a Yush. We saw her having Yush. If she actively had a Yush, Leah could go and take it and keep it, and Naomi has no legal recourse. And Leah has no legal obligation to return it to Naomi. Again, she could go above the letter of the law and return it, and Jewish law does say that's very commendable. But from a legal perspective, this object is now ownerless. And again, we're seeing how Judaism takes this very hard line on ownership is a very big reality. I want to conclude with a story. It's 9:05, so I'm going to conclude the class over here. I want to tell you a story. It's a personal story about my great-grandfather. So my great-grandfather's name was Rabbi Zalman Gurari. Zalman Gurari, he was a old-time Chabad chassid and a survivor of the war. And he had a very close, a very exceptional relationship with the Rebbe. It wasn't the regular relationship that the Rebbe had. He was a very, and he was an orphan from a very young age. See, he was a family member in the previous Rebbe's home, and the Rebbe trusted him in a way, had a much closer relationship with him than with most of the members of the Hasidim and the Chabad community. Here's a story. In the 1960s, two yeshiva boys are in Winnipeg, Canada. Chabad has a program. Every summer they send out peers of students to go to remote Jewish communities and service them. It's a beautiful, I hope you've heard from me, I've told you I've spent once a summer in Idaho doing part of this program. In the 60s, two boys went. And what you do is you go to the community, you go to these little shtetl, and you call up a reporter and you get a story in the local paper, and they're very happy to do it because in the middle of nowhere, there's not a lot to report. The two rabbis is a front page story. When I was in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, it's just in the news, Coeur d'Alene. When I was in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, we were front page news. Twice a week they have the Coeur d'Alene Times, whatever it is, and the big picture of us was front page news. We walked around, everybody recognized us. We're celebrities for a week in Coeur d'Alene. Okay, so they get a call. These two boys in Winnipeg from a Christian lady. She says, my son fought in World War II, and he came back with a Jewish book as like a souvenir from the fighting. And he got married and left, and I don't know where he went off to, and he's, I have no need for the Jewish book. If you want to come pick it up. So they weren't expecting anything too big. They go, and they see this is not just any Jewish book. This is a very, very, this is a treasure. It's a book of manuscripts of old classic Chabad texts. And they right away saw that many of this is unpublished. This could maybe be the last surviving manuscript. They right away understood this has tremendous value. This is a real find. But it has a name in the book. The book is owned by somebody. Who owns these manuscripts? Shneur Zalman Gurari. He's alive. He survived the war. This was part of his lost possessions from Russia, or from Rostov, or maybe Warsaw, probably Warsaw actually, at that point. He ran away from Warsaw. Okay, so this is his. What they did was, they took it, they brought it back to the Rebbe. They gave it down, the Rebbe then, especially in the 50s or 60s, was very, very invested in publishing all Chabad manuscripts. Everything should be published. And a lot of things that were thought they were lost manuscripts, everything became published. So he gave it to the Rebbe. They told the Rebbe, it says Zalman Gurari's name, who's a member of the community, we don't know what to do with it, we're just giving it to you. So the Rebbe called to my great-grandfather, Zalman Gurari, and it was done in a humorous way. And the Rebbe showed him his find. Look, this is a very precious book of manuscripts. But the Rebbe says, but I'm not giving it back to you. And the Rebbe stood up, went to the shelf, took out a book of Maimonides, and showed my great-grandfather the law. A possession that was left, that survived the war, is assumed that the owners had yiyush, and therefore it's ownerless. And whoever finds it, can keep it, does not need to return it. And the Rebbe says, I'm using this. I'm going to be publishing these manuscripts, whether you like it or not. And and my great-grandfather, of course, would have happily given it to the Rebbe, but that was the Rebbe's way of using this halachic idea too. And that's a little story. So it's a little humor story. So till today, it's not in our family's possession. If you go to the Chabad library, Chabad has one of the most prestigious Jewish libraries, and you ask for this manuscript, you'll still see it says his name in it, but he doesn't own it. Why? Because that's what Judas Law says. So with that, we conclude today's class, the Jewish value and the Jewish laws about ownership. Next week, we'll be talking about how Jewish law looks at people. Presumption of innocence, a lot of these types of cases, which is a beautiful grand finale to this course. What's the Jewish value, and how does even Jewish law implement the values of how we look at another human being? How do we look at another Jew? That's next week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us, Harry.
Thank you very much.